How do you know who to trust? You cannot read other people's minds, at least not in the sense that you can literally know their thoughts with the same level of intimacy as they do. This obvious fact reveals a fundamental issue at the heart of all interactions among human beings. We do not know if we can trust each other. That is, we never know if the person we're trusting may betray us. Moreover, many of us have been betrayed. Personally, I've been cheated on in romantic relationships, and like everyone else, I've been the victim of liars and deceivers in other domains as well. Yet, despite the fact that all of us experience betrayal at some point, we find ourselves trusting other people much of the time. We trust our employer to pay us on time. We trust the fire department to come when we call them. We trust our closest friends to be there when we need them. And we trust ourselves to rise to the occasion when that is what is required of us. With these examples, it is clear that trust is essential to a good life, both for the individual and for the society and the collective. In other words, trust forms the bedrock of all successful interpersonal, societal, and economic interactions. Yet, as noted, it's not exactly clear why any one individual should be willing to trust people, given the fact that in doing so, we open ourselves up to betrayal. In this video, I will outline the psychology of trust, and I'll try to answer the following questions. Why do we trust despite the risks it presents? Answering that will require us to examine decision-making under risk in general and decisions of whether or not to trust in particular. In a follow-up video, I'll compile what we've learned about trust-based decision-making and extract some lessons and tools that will help us to answer the question of how we can make better decisions about who to trust and when we should trust them. There we will examine the particular factors influencing our decision to trust with an eye for how we can use each of them to our advantage. A theme that will occur throughout is that trusting another person is a decision that involves risk assessment, with all the typical features of that kind of decision. Thus, as with any other type of risk assessment, in order to make optimal decisions about who to trust, we should be as rational and logical as possible. That doesn't mean that emotions are irrelevant or necessarily hindering. On the contrary, emotions are always necessary for decision making, whether we realize it or not. I am Andrew Cooper Sansone, and this is Sense of Mind. This channel is all about giving you the fundamental science about how your brain works and how your mind works so that you can upgrade your mind and improve your life. So we talk a lot about neuroscience, psychology, critical thinking, and mental health. And there are videos like this one, which is about critical thinking and psychology. But we also have an ongoing series on an introduction to neuroscience. So definitely check out those videos if you're interested in learning about the brain. We've got them at all different levels of difficulty, from beginner up to advanced. So definitely check those out if you're interested. Now, before we get into the rest of this video, I just want to give a little context for why I'm thinking about trust so much. We're living in a time, and perhaps humanity has always been in this situation, but it feels like it's emphasized or particularly acute right now, where it is very hard to know who to trust. The legacy media sources and the mainstream media that we've trusted for so long are not always as reliable as we'd like. Now, I think that publications like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the major news outlets are still doing good journalism. I wouldn't say that they've gone down a pit of post-truth or something like that. But I do think that there is often bias and there is often kind of selective reporting depending on what you're looking at. And so just on that note, with news and information that we're receiving from the media, it's important to know who you can trust and why you can trust them. And I hope that this video and the next one will give you an understanding of how trust works in the mind, and to be able to use that understanding to kind of enhance your ability to make trust-based decisions, to know who you can trust to just borrow your car, who you can trust to be a faithful romantic partner, and who you can trust to give you good information and why you can trust them, and maybe in particular circumstances when you can and cannot trust them. So anyway, the tools to make better trust-based decisions will come in the next video. This one will be about how the human mind thinks about trust and how it ends up making the decision to trust someone or not. Please be sure to follow if you're on Instagram, or subscribe if you're on YouTube. And like this video and give it a comment if you have any thoughts. I'm really interested to hear what you have to say. Okay, so let's turn to the central question of this video. Why do we trust despite the risks it presents? As mentioned at the outset, to trust is a fundamentally risky decision. You are vulnerable to substantial losses when you place your confidence in another person, whose intentions and incentives you cannot know for sure. The reason we so often trust others, despite such vulnerability, is that we have assessed the risks involved and come to the decision that the potential gains and the likelihood of their occurring outweighs the potential losses and their likelihood of occurring. To be clear, very few people are sitting around and consciously calculating, for example, the likelihood that their best friend is going to steal their car if they trust him to borrow it. But the reality is that such cost-benefit analysis are happening in some unconscious corner of our brains. Additionally, it's easy to imagine a time when you would do this kind of analysis consciously. For example, if a coworker who you barely know outside of work is asking to borrow your car. What you're seeing is a diagram of a model of trust-based decision-making that was formulated in a 2015 article by the German psychologists Isabel Thielmann and Benjamin Hilbig. I'll be referring to this diagram throughout the rest of this video so you can see how all the ingredients of trust-based decision-making come together. Let's begin at the top with the two factors that one would consider in these kinds of situations: trust cues and prior trust experiences. We will circle back to social projection in just a minute. First, trust cues. Trust cues are pieces of information that you glean from the situation at hand and from the particular individual you're interacting with. For example, in the case of letting your coworker borrow your car, you would consider the facts about the situation, including what kind of car you own. Is it a Lamborghini or a minivan? How far do they want to drive? Are they going to the store or driving home to Kentucky? And perhaps how easily you could get your car back if it did get stolen. That would all be information about the situation. What about the person? For that, you would consider things like whether this person is generally trustworthy. Have you heard any gossip about them and being less than forthright? Would they be motivated to steal it or careless enough to let it get stolen? Are they a good driver, or do they even have a driver's license? And do they actually need the car, or could they possibly get to the destination just as easily in some other way? Even though you consider these factors particular to this unique situation, the reality is that nobody is starting from a truly blank slate when it comes to trust. All of us have had experiences with trust before, and that brings us to the second factor to consider when making a decision of whether to trust someone. That is, prior trust experiences. These are precisely what they sound like. They're memories of similar past situations in which you trusted someone and some kind of outcome, either positive or negative, occurred as a result. If, for example, you trusted your cousin to drive your car across town and he got in a major accident that ended up costing you money and time and emotional energy, you will think about what particular contingencies of that situation made that bad outcome likely. Was the accident his fault? Was he drinking or texting at the time? How did he handle it? Did he take full responsibility, apologize, and attempt to reconcile? Or did he get angry, blame others, and make little effort to make things right? In short, you will consider the past situation and compare it to the current situation to see what relevant similarities and differences exist. Trust cues and prior trust experiences probably seem pretty obvious as factors affecting your trust decision making. But as you can see on the diagram, a related third factor is known as social projection. Social projection is the degree to which you believe that other people act and think like you do. For example, someone high in this characteristic would tend to believe that most people ride their bike to work, vote for politician X, and go to church every Sunday, just like they do. even though none of these activities are actually carried out by more than a relatively small fraction of society. So if you are a very honest, forthright, and fair-minded person, in addition to having strong tendency towards social projection, you will be more likely to see others as having those same qualities, which will make you a little more likely to trust other people, all else being equal, of course. But these expectations of trustworthiness are not the whole story. As you can see, trust cues, prior trust experiences, and social projection are all related because they feed into our trustworthiness expectations. That is, how trustworthy we judge the other person to be. Yet, even if all three of these factors are favorable, for example, if your coworker is known by all to be honest and responsible, if his reason for borrowing your car is that his own car is in the shop and he needs to get home to let his dog out, if every car lending experience you've had has ended up fine, and if you yourself are both trustworthy and believe that most other people are as well, there are nevertheless still some very powerful factors that will affect your ultimate decision and which we will consider next. Let's talk about risk and loss aversion. As human beings, we are prey to what psychologists call cognitive biases, which are errors in reasoning that arise naturally because of the way our minds are structured. For example, when it comes to risk assessment, there are at least two cognitive biases that affect our final decisions: risk aversion and loss aversion. Risk aversion, as its name implies, is the tendency to avoid risks even when there is a potentially huge payoff if things go well. A person is risk averse if he or she treats things as being more risky than they are in some objective sense. Consider, for example, the decision of whether to put your savings in a normal savings account or to invest it in the stock market. Someone with a high level of risk aversion would opt for the savings account every time because it presents a much lower risk of losing all their money since it's federally insured and not subject to market pressures. The fact is, however, that this person would be losing money because the interest rate of that savings account is most likely lower than the rate of inflation. But this individual would still opt for the savings account because they can be certain about the security of their money from the swings of fortune in the market. Okay, so even if a financial advisor could show them reams of data that make a solid case for putting some of their money into safe investments in the stock market, demonstrating clearly that the likelihood of losing it is almost non-existent, a highly risk-averse person would be very resistant nonetheless. As an obvious caveat, not everyone is highly risk-averse, or else we would not have a stock market, among many other things. In fact, some people are the opposite. They tend to treat situations as less risky than an objective analysis would suggest. Those people are referred to as risk-seeking. Others still are risk-neutral, meaning that their assessment of risk is generally in line with what an objective analysis would uncover. So, how does risk aversion affect trust? Well, as you might guess, your levels of risk aversion will make you more or less likely to trust another person, with higher risk aversion making you less likely, and lower risk aversion, or a risk-seeking tendency, making you more likely to put your trust in someone. As mentioned above, a distinct cognitive bias that also affects our risk assessment has to do less with how risky we perceive a proposition to be and more to do with how much we hate losing in general. This is called loss aversion. Loss aversion is a bias that makes people feel that, all else being equal, losing something is more painful than gaining something is pleasurable. In other words, losses hurt more than equivalent gains. For example, imagine a basketball player who is highly loss averse. He truly hates losing. He throws a fit every time his team loses, smashes his fist into lockers after the game, and is deeply disappointed until the next win. Yet when his team does win a game, he is just mildly excited and joyful. He does not throw an equivalently positive fit, nor does he experience a lasting happiness comparable in intensity and duration to the lasting disappointment of a loss. In contrast, someone with very low or non-existent loss aversion would be just as happy with a win as they would be upset by a loss. Once again, this is not the same for all people. Some are highly loss averse while others are not at all. Okay, so how does loss aversion affect trust? Again, it is somewhat obvious as to how your level of loss aversion might affect your tendency to trust other people. If you're highly loss averse, the prospect of betrayal will loom large in your mind, while the prospect of a beneficial outcome will not seem as consequential. So therefore, people with higher levels of loss aversion will be less likely to trust other people. Okay, so this brings us to another part of this model on the diagram, where dispositions toward anxiety and fear may be determinants of loss and risk aversion. Let's see what I mean by that. Okay, as you can see, Thielmann and Hilbig hypothesized that one's natural level of anxiety and fear may be linked to risk assessment, and specifically to such risk assessment in the domain of trust. They note that numerous studies have shown that, on average, people with naturally higher levels of anxiety are more risk averse. They also note that a much smaller number of studies have established a link from higher anxiety and fear to greater loss aversion. So, if these links do hold up, it's reasonable to speculate that people with naturally higher anxiety and fear will be less likely to trust other people, all else being equal. Okay, so the final factor in Thielmann and Hilbig's model of trust behavior is related to loss aversion, but it is much more specific to trust. This is called betrayal sensitivity. Betrayal sensitivity is a tendency to experience greater psychological pain when another person betrays you, as compared to when a materially equivalent loss occurs as a result of natural forces. For example, most of us would be more upset by having $100 stolen out of our hands than if the gust of wind did the exact same thing. Thielmann and Hilbig note that studies show that people are more likely to take a risk in a non-social setting compared to a social one, even if the risks are quantitatively equivalent. If you think about this, it makes a lot of sense. The reason is that the natural world is indifferent to you. So while it may on occasion cause you serious harm, it's not like nature is out to get you. However, human beings might actually be out to get you. I'm not saying that just because someone breaks your trust, it means that they are out to get you, but only that it's possible that a person can consciously target you and nature cannot. Obviously, if you are very sensitive to betrayal in this way, then that will make you less likely to want to trust other people. Just as anxiety and fear may be partly driving your levels of risk and loss aversion, and just as your levels of fairness, honesty, and social projection may be partly driving your general expectations of how trustworthy other people are, your tendency toward forgiveness may help determine your level of betrayal sensitivity. That is, if you are the type of person who is quick to forgive others, then you will be less likely to be deeply hurt by betrayal and therefore more likely to trust people. Now that we've described the pieces of the puzzle of trust-based decision-making, let's put them together into Thielmann and Hilbig's overall model. As you can see in this diagram, there are dashed lines connecting trustworthiness expectations to risk aversion and from betrayal sensitivity to loss aversion. That's because, far from operating in isolation, your trustworthiness expectations, which, as we noted, are gleaned from your assessment of the situation, as well as the person, and from your own level of fairness and honesty and social projection of those qualities. That feeds into your level of risk aversion in deciding whether to trust someone or not. Similarly, your natural level of betrayal sensitivity will strongly influence your level of loss aversion when it comes to trust decisions in general, because the decision to trust is social as compared to purely monetary. Overall, Thielmann and Hilbig argue that the most reliable predictor of trust is risk aversion. This makes sense because someone who is highly risk averse will avoid the risk associated with trusting, even if the potential payoff is huge and all other signs indicate that there is a very low probability of loss. But they note in most cases, people are not extremely risk averse, so the other factors will play bigger roles for most people in most trust situations. Okay, so that is basically it for this first video. Now, as I mentioned, there's going to be a follow-up video where we answer a second question, and that is, how can we use what we've just learned to make better decisions about trust? And some answers may already be coming to your mind by being more rational, more logical, paying attention to trust cues, thinking about past experiences and how they relate to the current one, and doing all that maybe a little bit more systematically than what we typically do. So I'm going to have a lot more concrete advice and tools in that video. But for now, just continue to think about this model, about how you end up trusting people. And I would really like to hear from you in the comments. Does this have a ring of truth for you? Do you see trust-based decisions in a similar way to other, risk assessments, other decisions that involve risk? I'm really curious. This is something that I hadn't thought a whole lot about before deciding to make this video and doing the research. And I started realizing how important trust is for our daily lives, and just how important it is for human progress, for all these things. And it does feel like we're living in a time where it's hard to know who to trust. And maybe this has just always been the case with humanity. Maybe we have just always been in this situation where trust is a risky decision. And I think that is probably true. And based on game theory and psychology and economics, it does appear that that pretty much must be the case. So while it's hard to know who to trust, especially when you're talking about information sources, rather than decisions like who to allow to borrow your car, it is still important to think about this model of trust-based decision-making, because it will allow you to start to generalize from specific, very concrete trust decisions like allowing someone to borrow your car to, what kind of information you can trust from that person or from some other source, from a news site. So we're going to be going into all of that in the next video. But I really wanted to give you this model, this idea about how human beings make trust-based decisions so that we could approach trust-based decision-making in a systematic way. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video at all, please give it a like and a comment, just anything that you think is relevant. Also, subscribe if you're on YouTube and follow if you're on Instagram. If you don't want to miss anything, make sure you hit that bell icon next to the subscription button on YouTube. And keep an eye out for our other videos. I'll have another video about dopamine coming out soon, and we'll have more of these kind of critical thinking videos, these videos about psychology and all of this. So please subscribe, follow, let me know what you think. I'm really excited that you're here. This video was produced by Andrew Cooper Sansone, and this channel is brought to you by the Diamond Mind Foundation. So thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.